Now, have you had a question earlier on about diversity, and what was the result of that? We haven't had it. Okay, well, I'll preempt that then. I think the expectation might be that I'm going to talk all about boardroom diversity, and I suppose I want to say that I will talk a little bit about that, but not exclusively. I think it is the tip of the iceberg on a number of issues that are important in terms of drivers of sustainable business success and particularly competitive advantage in today's world. So I have it as a segue into broader topic. I'm only going to talk for about 15 minutes, so I'm going to try and cover a few things quite quickly. But let me start with the issue around board diversity, because obviously it has been a big hot topic in this country. We have been seeing some progress. Now I've rushed on to my next chart. We have seen the shape of the line is very satisfactory to somebody who's been sort of campaigning this area since 2010, almost a doubling of the percentage of women on the listed biggest company boards. I know this conference is more on the smaller and medium-sized companies. But I think it's been more of a question of the mindset shift around this not being so much a political correctness point, but just about having a modern boardroom that has, and often gender is just the place to start, certainly not the place to end, in terms of engendering cognitive diversity, a difference of thought and perspective that makes for more challenge at the boardroom and makes for a better boardroom dynamic. It's been fascinating listening to the chairman of companies as they've sort of become very evangelical about this, because of course we're talking about their boardrooms, and they have said the conversation is better, the challenge is better, the decision making is better. Much more powerful coming from them than me. And the stats are very pleasing. Of course, there are no FTSE companies that don't have a woman on their board now. And then if you look at the level below, the 250, then we've also seen a quite significant improvement. There's more than a doubling of the percentage of women in all, and then there are only 23 all-male boards left in the 250. And of course, that sounds a lot, but it was more than half a few years ago when we started, less than 5 years ago. So I really think it's been something of an epiphany. Now, of course, people then start to critique it and say, well, it's all non-exec directors, and that is to a large extent true. And I think there's an article in the Standard today which makes the same point. It was always going to take longer to create more diversity, particularly around more women throughout organizations. But I think it's been very important seeing the discussion move from being a minority special interest topic to much more around how do we attract lots of different types of talent, not just more women, but younger people to take on responsibility, particularly given their digital experience, and obviously ethnic minorities, different types of educational backgrounds as well. Now, of course, many of you may be involved or thinking of or have done an IPO, and I guess one bullet that I didn't put on, partly because it looks a bit critical if you were sitting there, is that actually one of the laggards in this trend to date anyway has been when companies have gone to do an IPO, there's been very little representation, certainly beyond the sort of obvious candidates, as it were. The Financial News has run a couple of articles on this, done some data analysis over the last couple of years. 2013, I think there were 130 new directors of companies that had just listed, and only 15 of them were women, same sort of percentage last year. And to be honest, I think this is something of a missed opportunity, because clearly you might as well in life start as you mean to go on, and actually building a board that is very future-proof in terms of its composition would seem to me an obvious thing to do. However, I'm very conscious that actually it's probably not the first thing on people's minds when they are coming to market and thinking about all the things that they need to do. And one of the things that we have been working on with people who've asked us, and also chairmen who have been through that process, Alan Thompson, the chairman of Bodycode, came and spoke at a seminar that we held in conjunction with the Davis Committee last October on the evolution of the board. And this was really about investors' perspectives as well, in terms of how we think the board composition has evolved and whether there's a better result from an investor perspective at this stage around governance. And he was very candid about a couple of the IPOs that he had been engaged with in the early, or a little way back, where he said, frankly, it was a sort of scrabbling around exercise right towards the end of the process of going to market in terms of who was on the board, and it was all the obvious people who'd been working with the company for some time. When he thought about it, he realized that actually that wasn't a very thoughtful way to compose a board, and so in more recent IPOs where he's been involved, and it's been something that he's thought about much earlier, And I guess that's one of the points of advice I'd give to those who are in this stage of development, that actually getting people advisors, and obviously many companies, or companies tend to have many advisors involved in the whole process of bringing an IPO, getting them involved in the discussion at an early stage about the composition of the board, not just around any kind of social engineering around having women on the board, but actually what should the board be like? What tasks is it aiming to do? And to, I think, use the framework that now is quite well established in more established company boards in terms of analysing the matrix of capabilities, in terms of working out what you're actually trying to achieve and the challenges that the non-execs need to pose to the executives. It is still, I know, though, a challenge because often the companies are having smaller boards, and also the expectation is that you would need people with sectoral expertise. I just put a bit of a challenge down on that one as well, because actually sometimes an outsider can come up with the idea that people who are working very closely with a company don't always have. And if all of that sounds good, but you still don't quite know how to go about it, one of the things that 30% Club has been looking at has been whether it be valuable, and I'm very interested in any thoughts anyone wants to share either today or afterwards, with me on this, is to have something of a vetted database. So there are a lot of databases out there where people who haven't got non-exec directorship roles put themselves forward. And I completely understand that particularly a lot of executive search firms and a lot of users who are searching for people might not want to use that, because clearly that doesn't necessarily tell you much. Whereas having a database that's got a reference attached to it, people who've actually worked with people, but maybe candidates who would be below the radar screen of anybody thinking of sourcing candidates for a board, might be a useful idea. So I put that one out as a suggestion, asking your feedback. But as I said at the start, this for me is something of a tip of the iceberg. I think the whole journey over the past 5 years, certainly as I've been involved in this, has made me realize that actually companies, in terms of how the oversight process is working, but also how management teams are relevant and thinking ahead, in touch with customers and so forth, all the things that any business is going to be very engaged in, or should be, then there's a lot of soul-searching going on in terms of the disruptive forces around us. Clearly, asset management, the industry that I'm in, is by no means immune from those forces, arguably is right at the epicenter. So I'd done a little list, and I was going to run through each of those very quickly, just in terms of what I think are, really good news from the point of view of companies at the smaller end of the spectrum, but also some thoughts that I hope might be of some interest or use. So I do think, I've mentioned about diversity, but I think it's part of a broader trend, which is the need, and I wrote about this actually in my most recent Sunday Telegraph piece, but I do believe that there's a need for businesses to adopt a more human approach in terms of both how we're dealing with customers, but also how we're dealing with staff. And I think diversity, again, is an example of that. It's not the only thing. I think that there is this growing expectation, actually, that David can beat Goliath. Obviously, books have been written on the topic. But actually, I do believe that those very firmly established, very large corporations are now trying to overtly create an entrepreneurial spirit, that you might have an advantage at the smaller end of the scale. I don't think it's telling any tales out of school. My most recent appearance before this one, in a slightly manic day, was at BlackRock, their leadership summit, all the way at Stamford Bridge, for reasons I haven't quite worked out yet. But actually their big challenge is, it's a big, well-established, fantastic company in so many ways, how to nurture an entrepreneurial spirit in the context of very large, sprawling organization, very global organization. And again, I think at the moment there is the opportunity in a way that hasn't been probably at any stage in history, not least because of technology. I've just mentioned this, actually, it's related, that actually even in the bigger scale organizations, even in the public sector, there's an awareness that within the framework of even established businesses, we need to create and protect that entrepreneurial energy. Now, this one that goes back to my earlier theme, but it's not really quite as you might think. So I think that the huge, indisputable mega trends of globalization and technology are very much giving rise to a third. And I see this firsthand from dealing with lots of companies, both as an investor in them, but also competitors in the investment industry. And there's a realization that the forces of how you make things happen have moved quite significantly already and are going to continue to move away from a command and control, hierarchical, telling people what to do type of arrangement to a much more diffuse networking sort of type of influence and power. Now, obviously, we saw this in the run-up to some degree to the general election in terms of at least the number of political parties that were represented in all the debates and discussions and the, I suppose, diversity of thought that was coming through in quite a different way, I think, than any previous elections. The result, maybe something to do with our electoral system, wasn't quite reflective of that diversity of discussion. But I think that the interesting thing here is that there's a recognition that actually the qualities that you need in leaders in a different world where one is talking about building influence and bringing people along with you rather than telling them what to do requires a slightly different skill set. And I'm going to risk upsetting no, it's actually quite a balanced audience, but what I'm not saying is that men can't have these qualities, but actually women are naturally hardwired, and it's not just me saying that, but neuroscience, I think, and it backs up intuition, suggests that women are naturally more empathetic, tend to want to build consensus, are less confrontational, or at least less comfortable with confrontation. And actually, these qualities are more valuable in a world where you build your power base based on networks. Now, obviously, everybody complements each other's skills, and I'm certainly not arguing suddenly that women are better than men. What I'm saying is that we need both. And that backs up the other points about the diversity of thought in terms of challenge and so forth. I'm seeing this really starting to develop in terms of the thinking beyond the boardroom, and even the largest companies who absolutely have number one position in their market sectors are very cognizant, almost desperate sometimes, of the need to draw up talent from all different, well, certainly both genders, but also different types of talent, realizing that actually the command and control approach is just becoming obsolete, and to actually deliver the right type of culture within their firms, as well as reach their customer base, they need to really work hard on this, and it's not just a nice to have. Millennials. So again, it was a big topic at the BlackRock conference. We clearly are used to working in a certain way. I mean, I think I'm typical, probably pretty much like my parents, you know. We take the same commute to work, we sit at the same desk. We certainly use technology when we're at work, but actually in terms of how we deliver and how we are more productive in our working life, in our lives generally, we're really scratching the surface of that. Millennials, I think, this younger generation are coming through expecting to make an intellectual contribution anytime, any place, anywhere in the world. They also expect to work for companies with strong values in a way probably that certainly my generation, I'm still in my 40s, but only just, I think we'd have said that what we want to do when we left university is make money or become top of the tree in our chosen profession. And now actually very interesting talking certainly to my eldest children's contemporaries and people just a few years older than them, that they actually are factoring in the values of the profession or the organization or the environment in which they are going to or want to work into their decision making. And that means as businesses we have to move towards that if we want to create an attractive environment for those younger talent pool. And then, relatedly, I guess, serving higher needs is rewarded. Now, I have got a chart. This might take you now into the realms of where is she going with this. But anyway, let's go for it. So I think, and this is my final chart, and my sort of final point, but it's a big one to end on. This is a chart dating back a long, long time ago, 1943. And you may have come across the psychologist Abraham Maslow and his theory of the sort of 5 stages of the progression of human needs. Now, bear with me while I explain this, because it kind of brings everything together for me. There's the obvious things where we're providing or need food, warmth, shelter at the bottom. And then moving up, we want safety, we want to feel a belonging to our community. We then move on to having mastery and achievement driving our ambition. And then finally, hopefully, we get to a creative stage where we feel fulfilled, but also we are self-actualizing. We are pursuing our talent. We feel like we are whole beings. And clearly, we've moved in the world of work. I mean, even though he wasn't addressing some of this I came across most recently when I was looking at articles that were in how come some of the most successful companies going to IPO and actually having a huge stock market valuation have so little in the way of tangible assets and so much in the way of intangibles and such contrary business models than the ones we've experienced. And basically, companies like Uber, Airbnb, and so forth, and Facebook have been working much more towards the top of the pyramid. They have less assets to go on, but it's less premium is being placed by the market in terms of the bottom end of the spectrum. Now, this, I think, is quite an interesting shift, along with the fact of companies, countries, societies becoming more human, becoming more feminine, and becoming more diffuse in terms of how things are valued. And I believe that this gives us an extra impetus in our business lives as we think about how people now are expecting more. So the millennials expecting more. They're expecting the company they work for to go beyond the ones at the bottom of the pyramid and up towards the top. And I just think this is a natural, and a great evolution in lots of ways. Clearly, it doesn't apply across the universe. A lot of people in the world are still working to ensure that they have food and shelter, and I'm not in any way glossing over those challenges. But I do think we've moved to a point where those companies that are bringing something that is over and above the clear sort of basic needs, obviously this is, I suppose, a hyper-service economy, are going to be rewarded. And to achieve that, it's not just the idea that you have, obviously, but it is then how you achieve it, how you construct your own company. It's a long way round to getting back to women on boards thing, but that's really where I think, in my own thinking, one thought certainly has led to another, to the point where I believe that this is really a very useful model in terms of thinking again, and quite ironic that it was dated such a long time ago, in terms of thinking through why things, or the progression of human needs. Now, I will end on my 6 points here, some of which overlap, really because I do think my message ultimately is I think this is great news for companies at the smaller end of the spectrum. But obviously that means that you need to be true to the philosophy and true to the opportunity that you have if you're managing, leading, running smaller businesses. Because arguably, big giant companies are struggling to come to terms with a lot of these things. I say BlackRock I put as a bit of an exception. They were having a whole day around shaking up complacency, innovation. All their leadership team were there, certainly the ones based in Europe. Quite interesting to see a company that is challenging itself, albeit one that's at the top of its game. And as I say, I think that you have a great opportunity. It helps to have a few women on the boards, but clearly that's not the answer to life, universe, and everything. Thank you.
There's time to just take a couple of questions. Would anybody like to ask a question? Could I just ask a question while people make up their minds? Succession planning. You talk about what the future profile of a company would look like, but how would you see succession planning come into that?
Well, I think succession planning is absolutely vital, and obviously it's become much more of a focus, certainly within the investor community, not least because we've seen some clear blow-ups where people have not had good succession planning. So I hope it's a question, if you do have outside investors, that you are being asked and that you are thinking about. Clearly, again, there's no single solution or obvious answer, because I know particularly if you're running smaller companies, then there is a question of how many people do you have sort of as spares or heirs and spares. And certainly, I mean, Newton is not the biggest company. We have 350 full-time employees and probably about 50 contractors at any one time. And what we do is we, I suppose, continually refreshing, but also then developing the talent. And it goes back to, I suppose, how you run a vibrant, entrepreneurial feeling company that people feel very much they're being looked at for the next level. I'm not sure if that quite answers what you wanted me to address, really.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Okay. I might have gone completely off message of what you're expecting, but there you go. It's the advantage of just parachuting in, saying my piece. Any questions? Have I completely floored you? Yes, go on then.
Michael.
I mean, there are 2 points. Sorry, it's Michael Higgins. I have the pleasure of being chairman of the QCA. 2 points. One, the statistics. I was glad you stopped at the FTSE 250, because if you go below it, there was a survey. I think it was Norman Broadbent did, which showed that I think over a 2-year period, 400 appointments of directors on AIM showed that 6% were women. So there's a long way off it. And part of that problem is the ability to break out of traditional networks, which has to be solved. which I think supports the point that there needs to be an easier, more cost-effective way of breaking out of old-fashioned networks. But just going back to your last point about the opportunity for smaller mid-cap companies, if it's such an exciting opportunity, why is there such a lack of financial commitment from the major institutions to the small-cap sector?
So I think, you raise several points. So if I just touch very briefly on the issue of very few or very little diversity in the appointments of the companies below the 250 first. That's sort of why I was mentioning the IPO point. There's I think, you've got obviously often smaller boards, much more expert knowledge seemed regarded as necessary, and also then this network point. And I guess that's something that, again, to repeat the offer, that very keen to see if we could help in terms of develop. I actually do get approached most days. There's some amazing woman that sends me her CV who has the most unbelievable experience in a particular area, and says they struggle to get sort of seen by anybody because they're just not obviously on a radar screen, but yet have very relevant experience. So I just wanted to repeat that in case it got lost in the subsequent points. I think your point, actually earlier this week, I had participated in a roundtable hosted by Jim O'Neill at the Treasury on the issue of productivity and how the UK has a lot of work to do, obviously, even if one thinks the numbers are probably a little bit unreliable, because I think it's quite hard to measure productivity when you've got this huge shift in use of technology already. But we got on to talking about funding. And got on to talking very quickly about funding and how it's all very easy for people to kind of talk generally about this wonderful entrepreneurial society we want to create, but actually mechanisms for making sure. So a firm like Newton will have quite very specific mandates, and when we do invest where we can in smaller and mid-sized companies, but often we're trying to invest across the house, even though we're not the hugest, we still have 50+ billion pounds. It makes it quite difficult in terms of size, but the willingness is there. And how to then create some mechanisms. We listened to quite a few. There weren't a very large number of us there. There were sort of 5 people contributing different perspectives about this point about productivity, but a couple were investors more involved in private equity and a smaller scale investors, certainly to ourselves. And it was interesting that there was a sense that actually we could replicate some of the mechanisms, for example, that are in the States, that the government could set up, not just sort of white elephant type funding sort of vehicles, but actually there were examples where they've been trying already. I just think it needs to be done on a bigger scale, and we need to shift our understanding of risk as well, in terms of, it's not just because something's liquid tradable that makes it less risky. And I think that's a big part of education process. So it's I'm not giving a very clear-cut answer to say, but I think there are lots of levers to push, and I would shout loudly about that point, because I think you'd be pushing on a bit of an open door. Investors want higher returns, obviously. Zero interest rate environment. People are looking for the next big idea, but we're very hidebound in how we go about it, and I would shout loudly.
Indeed we will. Helen, thank
Pleasure.
you very much.
Thank you very much.
Really